Good morning, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's your boy Al here to talk a little bit of boxing with you guys. The Alexander Usyk, Daniel Dubois fight was as I thought it would be. Usyk dominated the fight. I want to talk a little bit about Usyk and his place in history, and just kind of this piggyback on a video made by Dan Morley, who talked about this not just notion that Usyk is now the greatest fighter of all time, but just that fighters in general just get misplaced, or their greatness gets overstated in reference to overall picture of boxing. First of all, congratulations to Usyk. He is an all-time great with what he's accomplished in his career, especially so late in his career. He's nearly 40 years old. That's a new thing now. You didn't see fighters doing that back even in the late 90s, early 2000s. But now you have fighters who get late starts. They have long amateur careers. They turn pro late. And then, they fighting, still winning fights, are still great at 38, 39, 40 years old. You have Arthur Beterbiev, if it was 40, who's still a top pound for pound fighter. So that is a new thing. But I want to talk about Usyk and his place in history and why I think it's a little bit overstated. Been seeing a lot of posts, and I agree with Dan Morley Boxing, who talks about people just going overboard, not just general fandom of fair weather fans or somewhat boxing fans, but even credentialed boxing experts, reporters, and broadcasters now saying Usyk may be, up there top 2 or 3 heavyweights of all time, stuff like that. You're seeing all this kind of stuff, and it's very irresponsible, very unstudied and unlearned to make such statements when you look at the whole scope of boxing. Now, listen, I know we live in an era where there are a couple of things going on, right? We live in an era where there are people who immediately, because of the age that they are in the era that they're living in, they immediately want to take everybody who they've been privileged to watch in their prime of their years, in their youth, and it immediately put them right up there at the top, right? Because it's the person that they watch when they're young, and it's the person that's come along in their heyday, and so they immediately, and everybody's like that in every generation. We put at the top who rules when we were in our young days. So you have all of these young kids who are saying Usyk is the greatest ever because it's who they've been privileged to watch. If you ask 6 different men raising 6 different generations who the greatest quarterback of all time is, you get 6 different answers. Somebody in the 50s will give you a different answer. Somebody in the 60s may say Johnny Unitas. Somebody from the 70s may say Terry Bradshaw. Somebody in the 80s may say Joe Montana. Somebody in the 90s may say Peyton Manning. Somebody in the 2000s may say Tom Brady. Somebody now may say it's Patrick Mahomes. You'll get different answers because people resonate with who's great when they're in what they consider their greatest days. So I understand that that's going on. We have this thing where people want to prop up the people and appreciate more the people who are around in their day. Now there's a problem with that. Well, first, let me continue on. That you have that going on. You also have people who are of Ukrainian descent or Ukrainian or just white, who are excited to see a person who looks like them in this position where they were an all-time great boxer. And there's nothing wrong with that, because every race and nationality, creed, color gets excited and rallies around someone who looks like them or represents them. So there's nothing wrong with that. But you have people who are I see a lot of people from Russia. You see a ridiculous statement. You click on a profile and it's somebody from the Ukraine or somebody from that side of the world, and they just think Usyk is the greatest ever because they want the greatest ever to be from where they're from or from somebody with their background, and so they pump him up for believe he's the greatest of all time for those reasons. And then you have those fans who play to this whole quiet or should I say lazy narrative of, well, the athletes today are better, so Usyk has to be better than everybody who came before him, including Muhammad Ali, including Evander Holyfield, because he's now and they were then, and athletes are better. bigger, stronger, faster now than they were then. And if you know anything about boxing, you know that's not entirely true. Those rules don't resonate with boxing as they do in other sports like basketball and football. We'll explain that later on why that's not the case. But the problem with taking all three of these narratives is um, that it shines a light on a particular part in boxing history and ignores nearly 180 years that came before the people of today, right? Most of the time when you hear people take any one of these three narratives, they take one of these three narratives because their scope and their education on the whole picture of boxing is very, 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 very limited, right? They only know about the person they like, and you start asking them questions about people who you say may be better that came 20, 30 years ago, and they have no information or not enough information, or they're dismissive because in their minds, if I wasn't around to see him, he couldn't have been that great, right? This whole arrogant, generational arrogance that all of us have when it comes to the athletes of our day. Problem with that is, I always say this, I never allow in a boxing conversation for people to use ignorance as a talking point. I'll explain to you what I mean. If we're talking boxing and you say Arthur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol are the greatest two light heavyweights of all time, and I mentioned Ezra Charles, and what about Ezra Charles? And you say, man, I don't know about him. That's before my time. Don't nobody know about him. Well, you didn't just make a point for yourself against Ezra Charles. You made a point against yourself that you don't have the knowledge or the information to really engage in the discussion on the greatest light heavyweight of all time. You can't only know about the people you know about, not know about the people who are in the conversation and think you've made a point in lifting up the person that you think should be the best when you don't know enough about this whole scope. If you want to talk greatest light heavyweights of all time and all you can bring up is Arthur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol, and you can't talk Michael Spinks, you can't talk Bob Foster, you can't talk Gene Tunney, you can't talk Ezra Charles, you can't talk Archie Moore, you can't talk even Roy Jones Jr., you can't talk any of these guys, you can't talk Billy Conn. If you can't talk any of these guys, then you really can't talk the conversation. And an acceptable answer is not, I've never heard of these guys. If you've never heard of these guys, then for me, the conversation is over. Go back and study, do your homework. I don't know or I haven't heard about these guys is not an acceptable answer. If we're going to talk about the greatest of all time, you can't mention the greatest of all time. Only know about the person you know about and then engage in the conversation. And then you can't refuse to learn about the people who you don't know about. If we're having a discussion about who are the greatest civil rights leaders and you're 22 years old, you're going to mention Dr. Martin Luther King. You're going to mention Malcolm X. Your answer is not going to be, oh, well, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X were before my time, so I'm going to say Al Sharpton and Ben Crump and somebody else and start naming people. You wouldn't do that. They ask you some of the, great, people for, who've been, fought for freedom and progression of black people. You're not going to leave off Harriet Tubman because she was before your time. Because we had to study and know about people who came before us in these walks of life. And that's how a lot of people sound when you're trying to discuss boxing. And we mention people who came before you and you say, oh, that's before my time, and think that's an acceptable answer. That's not an acceptable answer. What you're basically saying is, I'm not qualified to engage in a conversation. So in reference to that, we'll talk about Alexander Usyk. Good win over Daniel Dubois. I don't think Daniel Dubois is a great fighter at all. He's clumsy. He's an ogre. He's an oaf. And I don't think that a win over him makes Alexander Usyk one of the 2 or 3 or even 5 greatest heavyweights of all time. I understand he's 3 times undisputed. I understand he's the undisputed heavyweight champion of the world. But you have to understand, and I've seen comparing him to somebody like, let's take Evander Holyfield, for example. I've been seeing posts, Dan Morley mentioned this, I think, people saying, oh, Alexander Usyk would have smashed Evander Holyfield. Like, calm down. First of all, Evander Holyfield was athletically superior to Alexander Usyk. use the same eyeball test you use when you're discrediting basketball players from the 60s and 70s, and you say they couldn't play with players today. You basically pull up film of them, you see how archaic it is, and then you make your point that they couldn't compete. We'll do the same thing with Evander Holyfield. Pull up clips of Evander Holyfield against Dwight Muhammad Kawi in his heydays, against Buster Douglas, or even in his first fight with Prime Riddick Bowe, and do the eyeball test. Pull up Alexander Usyk, look at his movements, his athleticism, his combination punching, and look at Evander Holyfield, his movement, his athleticism, his combination punching, and then you intelligently make the assessment that Alexander Usyk would have destroyed that guy. You can't do it. You can't do it. And use the same, don't move the goalpost either. If you can look at a video of Bob Cousy dribbling around with one hand and laugh and talk about how ridiculous it is to think that that guy dribbling with one hand would be able to compete with today's players who can, go left and right, then pull up the same footage of Evander Holyfield and show me what makes him so archaic that he couldn't have squared up with Usyk. It doesn't add up. The video doesn't add up. To connect the 3 points I made in reference to what people say about boxing, to bring it home to this argument, like a Usyk versus Evander Holyfield. First thing is in reference to Alexander Usyk. Yes, he's a great fighter. He's an all-time great fighter. He's definitely a Hall of Famer. But I can't put him in a class with people like Riddick, well, not Riddick Bowe, but Lennox Lewis, Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, George Foreman. I can't put him in that class, because even though he's 3 times undisputed and he's undefeated, one of the most important statistics about boxing or in boxing is level of opposition, right? Ezra Charles is 95 and 25, right? I think something like that. 95 wins, 25 losses, which for some people, like, no way he could be considered an all-time great. But he's considered generally anywhere from top 25 to top 10 all time with a 95 and 25 record. You want to know why? Because his level of opposition was through the roof. He fought multiple Hall of Famers across multiple weight divisions, beating some of the greatest fighters of all time. And even though he has a plethora of losses which happened later in his career, that level of opposition sends his rating through the roof. Take it Alexander Usyk, who's 23-0. Evander Holyfield, who I think is 44-10. People say, well, how could a guy 44-10 be greater than a guy 23-0? Well, let's start with the fact that the guy who's 44-10 fought 8 Hall of Famers in 15 fights. 15 fights against 8 Hall of Famers. The great Dwight Muhammad Kawi, who's one of the greatest cruiserweights of all time, fought him twice. Michael Moore, I believe, is a Hall of Famer now. Fought him twice. Prime Riddick Bowe, fought him 3 times. Prime Lennox Lewis fought him twice. Mike Tyson, who wasn't prime but still great, fought him twice. James Toney, who he fought later but still fought him, lost to James Toney, but fought 8 Hall of Famers, 15 fights against 8 Hall of Famers. Usyk has fought 1 Hall of Famer. I'll give you Tyson Fury. He's a Hall of Famer. Beat him twice. But no other Hall of Famers on his resume. You can't take a guy who's 23-0 with 1 Hall of Fame on his resume and say that he's greater than a guy who's 44-10 with 15 fights against 8 Hall of Famers and beat some of them at their best. He beat Prime Riddick Bowe, even though Bowe, probably had too much cake in between the first fight and the second fight. But he stood there with the best Riddick Bowe who ever was. By the way, Prime Riddick Bowe, the night he beat Evander Holyfield, slaughters Usyk. Prime Lennox Lewis slaughters Usyk. Let's put it into context. Usyk looks great, but who is he looking great against? He's not looking great against the greatest heavyweights ever assembled. Evander Holyfield had to fight some of the greatest heavyweights ever assembled. And when you have to fight 15 fights against some of the greatest heavyweights ever assembled, you're going to lose some fights. You fight against one of the slickest cats who ever lived in James Toney. Yeah, you're not going to look, especially when you're older, you're not going to look good. So Usyk's a great fight, but let's keep it into perspective. 1 Hall of Famer fought versus a guy who fought 8 Hall of Famers. Now let's look at some of the arguments that people make that we alluded to earlier. We already talked about people only wanting to pump Usyk up because he's their guy, he's their generation. Again, a lack of intelligence and education in the sport is unacceptable. Anybody who's going to talk intelligently about a 200-year-old sport has to um, know about the sport. Let's talk about the argument of um, athletes today are bigger, stronger, faster. The athletes of yesterday are archaic. Again, from about the 1950s to now, when you look at a lot of the fight footage from then until now, there isn't this laughable separation of talent, skill set from the late 50s up until now. If athletes are bigger, stronger, and faster in boxing, not in football or basketball, but in boxing, then explain to me why there has not been a heavyweight come along in 60 years and athletically surpass Muhammad Ali. You pull up the footage of Muhammad Ali dancing around against Cleveland Williams. Show me a heavyweight today who makes him look laughable. Like Cousy dribbling around one hand, or the shoot fighter, the basketball players in the 60s shooting with one foot in the air and shooting a little old granny hook shot, and you laugh at that like, man, that couldn't go today. Show me from a footage of Muhammad Ali what wouldn't go today against today's heavyweights. Can't do it. How is it that we've seen all this advancement athletically in other sports but haven't seen it in boxing? There hasn't been an athlete who surpassed Muhammad Ali athletically. There hasn't been a fighter who surpassed prime Mike Tyson athletically. Where has the advancement for prime Mike Tyson? Prime Mike Tyson, believe it or not, those of us are getting older, was over 40, was about 40 years ago now. I mean, if we making that argument that athletes are bigger, stronger, and faster in boxing, if athletes get bigger, stronger, and faster in boxing, how was a guy able to win the heavyweight championship of the world in 1975 and win it again in 1995? A running back couldn't win the rushing title in 1975 and come back and do it in 1995. A quarterback couldn't quarterback an MVP season in 1975 and come back and do it again in 1995. But a fighter won a heavyweight title in 1975 and came back and won it in 1995. If athletes get bigger, stronger, and faster, then athleticism should have passed him by, and he should have never been able to do that. You take a guy like James Toney, who won his first world title in 1991, which was right in the middle of Michael Jordan's prime. And he fought, and he was a top 10 pound for pounder up until the 2010s, which was the middle of LeBron James' prime. If the argument is the athletes from Michael Jordan's day can compete with the athletes of LeBron James' day, how is it that James Toney was able to be a world champion in Michael Jordan's prime and a world champion up until LeBron James's prime? Same thing with Bernard Hopkins. Won his first world title in 1993, was a top 10 pound for pound fighter up until like 2014, 15, something like that. How did that happen? If athletes get bigger, stronger, and fast, shouldn't athleticism came and run those guys off the table? But it couldn't. They were still sticking around. Why? Because athletes aren't bigger and stronger and faster in boxing. Let me explain to you why. Boxing in its infancy was the only sport where people were really able to make mega bucks as an athlete. Sometimes I know young people joke all the time about old school athletes being plumbers and lawyers and things of that nature. But there's really some truth to that, because in its infancy, baseball, basketball, football didn't make you rich. They didn't pay mega bucks, right? So these people had to have summer jobs. They did have to be plumbers or lawyers or insurance salesmen during the summer, because being a professional athlete in basketball, football, and baseball didn't pay well enough for you to be able to live off of. But the one sport that did was the sport of prize fighting. Prize fighters didn't have to have a second or third job, because prize fighting made the fighters rich. When Babe Ruth was negotiating to become the highest paid baseball player in Major League history at $60,000 a year, that same year, Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey were fighting for $400,000 and $300,000 a piece for one night, respectively. Do your math. 60,000 versus 300 and 400,000. 1980, Bill Walton and Moses Malone became the first athletes in basketball to make $1 million a year. The first athletes with a 7-figure salary at $1 million a year. That same year, Roberto Duran and Sugar Ray Leonard fought the brawl in Montreal. Ray Leonard made $8.5 million. Roberto Duran made $4.2 for one night. Do your math. $1 million for a year. 8.5 4.2 for one night. And boxing always dwarfed all the other sports in income. It was the one sport where you can get rich. And because it was the one sport that you could get rich, boxing received the greatest athletes first. The prime athletes went to boxing. The rejects went to basketball. The rejects went to baseball. The rejects went to football. They couldn't make it in boxing. I've heard several Hall of Fame athletes in football and basketball talk about how when they were young, they wanted to be a boxer. They went to the nearest boxing gym, but they couldn't hack it. They weren't tough enough. It wasn't their sport that they were good at. So they had to go and do something else. They wanted to do boxing first. Why? Because boxing was a sport that made you rich. There were only athletes walking around town that were rich up until the 70s and 80s were boxers. Other athletes weren't rich because those sports didn't pay like boxing paid. And because boxing paid, boxing got the best athlete. It got the prime cut athlete. But what happened is, as football in salary started to rise, as basketball salary started to rise with the height of the popularity of Magic Johnson and Michael Jordan and Larry Bird, and as football became more popular in America, the salaries began to rise. It became easier to make the big money in basketball, easier to make the big money in football. So what happened? Boxing started to lose the prime athletes to the sports where the money became guaranteed. Because in boxing, even though when you make it to the top, you get the big money, it takes longer to get. And in football, where you can turn pro, get drafted, and get a $30 million signing bonus without ever touching the field. In basketball, where you can get rich and get drafted and sign a $1 million contract before you ever do anything, and the money's guaranteed. Those sports became more appealing to the top-notch athlete. And the top-notch athletes started going over to basketball and football. And what happened with boxing is boxing started getting the guys who weren't good enough to make it in those sports. And so the scenario flipped. Now boxing gets the rejects. When you look at Daniel Dubois, you look at all of these heavyweights today, the black American heavyweights, these guys walking around with all this blubber around their waist. They walk around, they look like they need a girdle. They're fat, they're out of shape, they're stumbling around. They are the reject athletes. They are not the prime athletes. The prime athletes are on the basketball court. The prime athletes are on the football field. Muhammad Ali, if he was around today, he'd be a quarterback. George Foreman would have been Ray Lewis if he would coming around today. Think about it. Can you imagine Allen Iverson in a boxing ring as a welterweight with that athleticism, as great as he was an athlete? Can you imagine him? Can you imagine a Nate Robinson as a little lightweight? But these guys chose basketball. Why? Because basketball became more popular. The money was easier to make than boxing. So boxing started losing would-be superstar prime athletes to other sports. So when you say athletes are bigger, stronger, and faster, that's not the case, because the athletes who would have been bigger, stronger, and faster in boxing or in other sports. So boxing doesn't get the prime cut anymore. It gets the chitlins of the athletes. It gets the rejects. Now, in the lower weights, there's still some prime athletes there. Terrence Crawford, Canelo Alvarez, now Inoue, still prime athletes. I'll even put Usyk in that. But what you have to understand is Usyk has the blessing of not being able to face great black American heavyweights, because the great black American heavyweights are playing linebacker, or playing running back, or playing cornerback, or playing strong safety. And so when I see an Usyk be great, I'm like, yeah, you're great, but you're great against an athletic pool that has been greatly diminished because the athleticism is now in other sports. Athletes are not bigger, stronger, and faster in boxing. Please drop that narrative. It's been 30-something years. We still haven't seen another Roy Jones with that kind of athleticism. A guy who can play a professional basketball game in a day and come and defend his title at night. We haven't seen that kind of athleticism in 30 years. So no boxing athletes are not getting bigger, stronger, and faster. The technology may be getting better. The drinks and juices and powders may be getting better, but there still aren't greater athletes in boxing today. There isn't a fighter alive who has the combination punching and the fluidity of a Sugar Ray Leonard. There isn't a boxer in the world who has the sharpness and the jab in the right hand of a Thomas Hitman Hearns. Those guys are far superior, not just athletically, but they're far more superior skill-wise. So when I see Usyk, yeah, he's great, but I have to remember and take into consideration who he's great against. I'm not going to say he would beat Muhammad Ali because he beat clumsy Dubois, because he beat old Tyson Fury. Tell me what you think. Am I on track? Am I off track? Peace.